that I'm putting together regarding this idea of something called wiretapping in Autofac. I saw the name online for trying to implement a feature like this, so I've kind of just assumed it. So I'm going to put a link to the original video so you can click through if you didn't see it already. But just to touch on what wiretapping actually is and why this came up in the first place. So Autofac is a dependency injection framework, and I had something proposed to me that was essentially if we don't really have control over the core application and we want to be able to inject our own implementation of a service, but also have that new service consume the originally registered service, how can we do that? So essentially you're doing like a man in the middle or, wiretap. So I put together an example of a couple of things to try it out and had it working. But as I started to do it, I was essentially coming up with a few things that I started to question, like what if someone using this, what's the expectation around the API? What feels good? What feel like like I don't even know. Just because it's working doesn't necessarily mean that it feels good to use, that it's obvious to use. So I wanted to make this video about sort of the next step I took after getting some functionality in place, and then how personally I like to use in a situation like this. I like to use unit tests, so XUnit and mock and other things. I don't even think I ended up using mock for this, but essentially it lets me put together a few different scenarios, actually use the code, and then have some expectations around the behavior. And then when I do that, as I tweak things, I can say like, this test still passes, which is good. I didn't break the behavior, and it still kind of looks the way I want to write the calling code. And I can keep adding more and more scenarios to it and seeing like what feels good and bad. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I've gone ahead and I moved over a bunch of the code I was working with in the past video from like this sample console project into my own sort of library project that I have some unit tests and stuff with. So there, sorry, you couldn't see my cursor. So I have, essentially a main project that has some like Autofac extensions that I want to keep building up so that I can use those on my own projects. Maybe I'll release them and other people can try them out. And then I have a test project down below, which is where all my unit tests and functional tests and stuff are going to go. Oops, didn't mean to open that, sorry. So I want to talk about sort of the first steps I started taking once I had something that felt like it was kind of working. So the two main things that came up in the last video and kind of walking through some stuff, because there were bugs in the code I was demonstrating. And I guess they're bugs in the sense that they didn't have like the functionality that was present isn't necessarily what I would have expected. You could argue, maybe that's totally what someone would have expected, but I don't personally feel so. So I wanted to kind of come up with some of these scenarios and then start iterating on them. So I've gone ahead, maybe I can zoom in a little bit here. I've gone ahead and put together a bunch of these XUnit tests. If you're not familiar with XUnit, essentially I can mark a test method, with a fact. There's other things you can do, but fact is sort of like your basic unit of a test. And what I've done, most of these tests are very similar, so I'll just kind of walk through the structure of it. Because I am making extension methods for a container builder in Autofac, I have to make a new container builder. I'm going to end up, this is sort of the method that's being, this is like a setup part. So I have a really simple class. I don't even think this class does anything, but it's essentially a class that needs an interface, which is going to be iTest interface. So I register it a particular way. If you remember in the previous video, again, if you haven't seen it, like click the link and go watch that first. It'll make more sense. But I was talking about different ways that I could register these. So this one is marked as single instance. And the idea was that then I can call my new extension method, which will perform the wiretap. And the wiretap says when someone goes to resolve iTest interface, we want to run this this function. So this function will give us the original sort of base instance, as it's been called here, and we're going to return a new class. In the other video that I put together, I don't need to do it in these coded tests, but we were able to take the base instance and pass it into this class. I don't need to do that in my actual test. I'm actually just doing a little assert here that checks, is this base instance actually the underlying type that we expected. So are we about to wiretap the thing we expect? So that's kind of cool. And then once that wiretap and the registration set up, this is sort of standard Autofac stuff. So we have a container builder. We're going to build the dependency container. And then it's pretty common practice that you make a sort of a lifetime scope for that container. I'm not going to get into the details about lifetime scopes and everything else, but essentially it's just a way that you can literally, as the name implies, you can scope your resolutions of services. So the bulk of the test and the assertion is sort of in here. So in this particular test, and I've named it a way that sort of suggests the method that's being tested. So it's just wiretap, and I've called it default wiretap. So naming conventions for tests, people have their own things. I like to do method under test, then an underscore, then sort of the parameters of the configuration of the test, then another underscore, and then sort of your expected result. That's generally what I like to do. So the fact that this says default wiretap in front of it feels kind of weird because the method under test is wiretap. I put default here because there were no other parameters in this case. It's actually completely omitted. There's other tests that have some other stuff here. So those ones are not called default. They'll be called something else. But anyway, that's what the default means. But we do a single wiretap, right? So that's what the single tap means because we have a single wiretap. It says the base is a single instance because you can see that right here. And then the last part of this says we expect that the same wiretap instances come out. So in this particular test, we actually try to resolve iTest interface twice. And if we weren't doing any wiretapping at all, what we would expect, because Autofac has marked this as single instance, is that instance 1 and instance 2 will be the exact same instance. It's not just the same type, it's literally the same reference. So we'd be able to test that. However, we're wiretapping it. And one of the things I was experimenting with was maybe it would be really nice to just have sort of a default expectation of, you're about to wiretap something. It happens to be marked as single instance. Your new wiretap maybe should be single instance as well by default, right? So you don't have to explicitly say new instance or single instance. You don't have to know anything about the underlying registration. It just kind of like it does what you expect. And that's really the interesting question is this what we expect? I don't know. So I wanted to play around with it and put some tests together. That's kind of what this whole thing's about. So in the end, this did actually feel good to me. So I would resolve 2 instances. I just do a quick check to make sure that the instances that we get back, they're not null, and they're actually sort of the resulting wiretapped type, right? So the wiretap did work. That's sort of what these 4 lines are checking for us. And then the interesting part is this last line, is that we're going to check that instance 1 and instance 2 are the exact same reference. Now, that happens because I made the default behavior when your base registration is single instance, that your wiretapped instances will also be sort of registered as single instance behind the scene. So that was like one example of a test I made. I'm like, okay, that feels pretty good. I might not go into as much detail on all of these, but then you can see like the next test below, it's almost the exact same, but you can see already the name is different. It says single explicit wiretap, right? So remember I was talking about the first, I'm going to scroll up so I can show both parts, but this single uh, instance for wiretap is passed as a parameter, whereas this other one does not have any parameter here, right? The default is no parameter, and it will just do what the base one expects. So if the base was single instance, you're going to get single instance. If it was not, you will not. So that's what this test proves. It actually, the rest of the test is identical. And the reason why is the default behavior behind the scenes will end up sort of figuring out that because this registration here was single instance, um, like when we explicitly say it, the implicit version actually figures out that this parameter should be single instance. So these two tests that I've just gone through look almost identical, which again, to me, that's actually what I expected. So once I put the test in place, I was like, this is starting to feel good. Um, that wasn't the case the whole way through, so we're going to see some examples of where that kind of falls apart. And here's the first example of that. So um, the way, what's interesting about this one, I guess, is I'm talking about another explicit parameter for the wiretap. So this one was a single instance being explicit. And this one is we're going to say that we want new instances, like multiple instances. Every time someone goes to resolve this type, we should make a new instance. But the base registration is single instance. So what I found was that based on how the registration, like how I made my function, um, it turns out that the sort of the wiretapping mechanism never executes a second time if this is marked as single instance. So what that means is that once I do a resolution and I wiretap once, if this base registration is marked as single instance, the next time we go to resolve the type, we are essentially guaranteed that we're just going to get the same instance back. So to me, I was like, oh no, like that's not what I expected. I would have thought that maybe I could share the same base instance and then let my callers be able to say every time someone resolves this, share the same base instance, but let's keep making new instances of our new type, right? Like why not have that configurability? I can't think of a reason off the top of my head, but why not allow it? So unfortunately, like I mentioned, the way I have the wiretap set up in the code behind doesn't actually work that way. So I said, okay, well, it's not to say this is impossible to do, but I said what I'm going to do is actually make it so that when someone tries to do this, the expected behavior is that we tell them you can't, right? So I make it throw an exception. I check that this message is what we expect to get up. And essentially, it's telling you the base type is registered as single instance. You cannot make your wiretap multi-instance because of this. So that's now the expected behavior. It's not what I wanted. As I mentioned, it's not what I wanted, but I figured, okay, let me put this in place for now. I have a test that proves this is the current expected behavior. If I have time after, I can maybe come back and revisit this and say, okay, everything else is working as I expect. How can I approach this particular thing as a new feature? How can I take this expected behavior and say, you know what? I don't want to expect that we get an exception now. I expect this works. I expect that I should be able to wiretapping at multiple instances. And then I can come back and really focus on this test, right? I can say, you know what? Like, let me go change all the code behind to try making this work. I can change the expected assertions, and that when I run the suite of tests, all the other tests are still passing. And then this test that I'd be altering, I'm pointing with my hand, sorry, this test that I would be altering, which is the one we're looking at, that one would actually be, the one that's in flux that we're changing up, and that when everything works, that one starts to pass now, and it's not throwing an exception. So this is that was a really long-winded way to say that this is something I want to come back and look at. It's not doing what I want, but at least now I have a test that tells me this is currently the expected behavior. why I think that's important in general for coded tests is that um, it's kind of weird to think about. I think sometimes people think about writing, a coded test, a unit test, whatever it happens to be. They're like, here's like a shiny feature. It does thing X, Y, and Z. So we should write tests that prove like it does things X, Y, and Z. Um, this is almost the inverse, where it's like in my opinion, like the feature doesn't do what I want it to do. It sucks. Like I'm not happy about it. However, it's not about whether it's doing the good thing or it's doing it makes me happy. Like you have to remove that completely. I'm actually testing that there is expected behavior, right? The expected behavior is not personally what I want, but this is actually expected behavior. There's a couple of really cool examples that I've had in my professional career where we've come across bugs. So we'd be refactoring something, fixing another bug, whatever it happens to be, and we come across another bug and we go, oh no, like what do we do? Like, do we stop everything we're doing? Do we fix this at the same time? Maybe it's really trivial. I don't know. It could be any number of things. But what's actually really cool is that if the code is already testable, you can put a test in place that actually says, we expect this bug, right? It sounds kind of silly, but like you expect this bug to happen. And what's really cool is, if you're using, stories and tickets and whatever tracking systems, maybe you file the bug and you have that, great. But when you have this test in place, what's really cool is that when someone fixes it, they actually have now a broken test, right? By fixing the bug, you've broken the test that actually checks for the bug. Um, but the reason that's cool is that they can usually flip a couple of conditions in the test, and now they have their test is already written for them. So by writing the test, you're actually kind of doing a bunch of the other work that will be coming anyway, without having to go, pull apart code and stuff. Anyway, this is just an example of basically testing expected behavior, even though it's not behavior we're happy about, right? Okay. So continuing on, now these examples change up a little bit. We're going back to a default wiretap like the first one. It's still a single wiretap, as we can see, there's only one. But what's changed now is that the base registration is multi-instance. So the other ones used to say single instance here, right? These ones don't. So what do we actually expect to happen? Well, the default wiretap, so no parameters specified here, I was saying, well, if the original registration was expecting new instances, then when we wiretap, by default, maybe we should get new instances, right? So that's what this test actually checks. So we'd resolve instance one, right? And then instance two. These check that the wiretap actually worked, but this line right here is special because it's saying instance one and instance two are not the same anymore. They're not. This test could probably be enhanced a little bit. It makes it a little bit trickier to read, but this line in particular, I'd have to go double check the internals of what's actually happening with the wiretap, but I believe that this method, this body, should run twice. And what I might be able to do is actually say the first time it runs, maybe store the base instance, and the second time it runs, compare the second base instance that's come in to the first one, and they should also be different instances. It's a small little enhancement that kind of proves that like this test was set up with the right registration, right? It's not single instance. Anyway, so that was another test. Sort of the next ones that come up are extensions of that, kind of very similar to the original ones, where now I'm putting in explicitly we want single instance. This one is kind of inverse to the one that was throwing an exception. So the base one is multi-instance, right? Because what I've highlighted does not have single instance anywhere. But we're saying explicitly that when we wiretap, we now want to have a single instance coming back. So the fact that this one works and I couldn't make it work the other way kind of bothers me. So I do want to go back. I keep saying it, but I want to go back and fix that other functionality to make it so. However, this test will prove that even though this is a multi-instance registration, then when we go to wiretap, we will get the same instances coming back when the wiretap occurs. And that's because we've explicitly said here we want a single instance. This next one, again, very similar, but it's just that this one says new instances. So this test should be essentially exactly like the default behavior, right? The default behavior here will go figure out that because our original registration up here does not have single instance, that this parameter should be new instances. So this test, the body of it looks exactly like the one that's 2 up that we've already looked at. These other ones are pretty cool. So in my first video, I was talking about a lot of stuff in Autofac. Maybe not a lot. That's maybe not the right way to say it. But there's syntax in Autofac that if you were to do a registration and you said register type A as interface X, and then if you did register type B right after that as interface X, when you go to resolve interface X, you will get B back. So it overrides registrations. It will always take the latest registration if you're resolving a single service. If you're doing an enumerable of them, it will give you the setback. However, if you're doing a single one, it will always give you the latest registration. So when I was making the other video, I was talking about, well, I think that if I do multiple wiretaps in a row, I think maybe I should do overriding. When I actually, and this is sort of the second really important thing I wanted to talk about in this video, which is I'm kind of coming up with something right now that I don't know. Like I've said it a few times, I don't know what the expected behavior should be. It's working, but is it working as people would expect? I don't know. That's the goal. So by writing these tests out, I actually get to really exercise the API. I get to be the person that's like, sure, I'm building the implementation, but I get to be the one going, okay, well, I'm gonna set this code up. I'm gonna try writing what a wiretap looks like, and I get to be the one that says, like, you know what, this syntax sucks. Like, I don't care if it could be working perfectly, but the syntax is garbage to work with. It makes me not want to use it. So again, by writing these tests out, I get to play with the API and go, you know what, this doesn't feel good, or this part feels great if I can make these other pieces kind of feel like that. Like, it really actually lets you use your code that you're writing. So you get to think about both sides of it, not just, oh, does it work, but also, does this feel good to use? Because if it feels like crap to use, you're going to have people writing crappy code to use your code that's hard to use. And then everything gets crappy. So it's a really good opportunity, in my opinion, that, when you're writing tests and stuff out, and you have full control over the API that you're putting together. If you don't, then that's a different story. But if you have full control over it, it's a really good exercise to be like, ask yourself seriously, does this feel good to use? Like, maybe, I'll just give you an example. Maybe doing a wiretap and passing in this anonymous function, you're like, you know what, that feels really stupid. Like, I don't like that. A lot of the stuff in Autofac, I mean, they have some stuff with callbacks, but they do this this builder pattern where they say register type, but then they can say single instance right after. So you keep chaining these methods up, and that feels really good to use. My wiretap method doesn't do that, right? So maybe I would want to say like .wiretap, and then where I'm passing in those explicit, I'm scrolling up again, sorry, where I pass in these extra parameters, maybe it would be really cool to say .single instance. Right? Maybe that would be what people want. I don't know. But by writing this out, I've actually been able to play with it. I do feel that having this callback function feels okay. I felt that having the extra parameter, if you want to put it in for the explicit single instance or multi-instance, that doesn't feel so bad. So I was reasonably happy with it, but keep saying it. It let me get to practice it, right? It let me get to try out the code, see if the API felt okay. So one thing I learned touching on the previous video was I did say that maybe I do expect this behavior to override the wiretap. When I tried it out and started using it more, I was saying no, like it doesn't. I actually personally believe that after using this, if I were to put multiple wiretaps in place like this, I do expect them to chain together. So when you wiretap and then you wiretap after, um, the first wiretap will then go into the second wiretap, and then if you had a third, that would go into the third, and so on and so forth. So I was like, that's what I'm going to make. I'm going to change the code so it fully supports this and it's consistent. I'm going to come back to that word consistent at the end of all this because that's sort of how I want to summarize this video. But I wanted to make sure that I could get that functionality. The cool thing is, I do think that how I have the code behind, if I want, I can change up the API to actually allow overriding wiretaps. So if you knew or you were like, I want to make sure nothing else is wiretapping. I don't want to chain things together. Like I'm stopping this. I think that I can change up the code, maybe alter the API a little bit, and actually say whatever wiretaps existed, kill them off. We're going to replace it with a new one. So I think I can write that. If I go to do that, I have all these tests in place still, which is great. I can make sure that I'm not breaking any functionality as I go to add new functionality. So just to kind of summarize that part, I did feel that having multiple wiretaps in a row should chain together. So this test shows that the first wiretap, the base instance, we're expecting it to be the original test implementation, right? Because it's a type we registered up here. Then when we wiretap the second time, you can see that the base instance is actually the wiretap instance from before. And then we're going to return a new, I was really creative with my naming, it just says 2 on this type. So the second wiretap takes in the first wiretap, and then our assertions at the end here look very much like before. Because the default is single instance, right? Single instance up here, and we're implicitly saying we're going to rely, because I didn't put the type on, or the parameter on here, we're explicitly saying we want to take whatever the original one was. These will also be single instance. So you can see this set of checks down here says both instances are the second wiretap, and both these instances are equal. Cool. Okay, so one thing that was interesting about this is that it didn't work the first time I did it. The test kept failing, and it kept failing because actually the way the code behind works is that it inverts the order of these wiretaps in a way that I didn't expect. So the code behind actually made the assumption that your last wiretap, right, so the second one here, it would actually make it go first, and then your first one would go second. So it was completely inverted. So it was really cool that once I had this test in place, and I'm going, like, I don't get it. Like, I wrote this test, and this is the behavior I expect, right? Why isn't that happening? I could step through it, and then I realized, like, I see my 2 wiretap registrations. What's going on? I haven't necessarily figured it out, but it did invert the order. So instead of adding to a list of wiretaps, I insert them at the beginning, and it fixes it. Again, I have the test in place, so if I accidentally later go, oh, why am I inserting things? Why don't I just add them to this list? I have a test that will catch that for me. That's mostly it. I have this last test here, which is essentially just like, multiple wiretaps at the default, not single instance, right? So that we can do 2 wiretaps on not a single instance, that these two wiretaps come back as different instances. So that covered most of the scenarios that I could think of as I was going through in the past video. As I was kind of talking and looking at the output with everyone, it was like, you know what? That feels like a bug. It's not what I expected. So that's why this was important to me. I mentioned I wanted to talk about consistency, sort of to wrap this up. And I think that was a big takeaway for me is that when I'm trying to think about what behavior is expected and what's not, I think part of it is kind of like, um, getting to use it. You'll see like this. You kind of have this gut feel about what feels right and wrong. Like if something wasn't obvious as you're using it, and it had a different behavior, you might go, like maybe we should change that. However, in my particular case where that situation where I throw an exception and it's not behavior I want, my argument there is like at least it's consistent now. So anytime someone has that ordering of registrations with those parameters, it will consistently throw that exception for people. I wanted to make sure that as I was going through this, I thought about consistency because I think ultimately that's going to be one of the biggest things that makes something feel good to use. Aside from the syntax, I think if your API has behavior that is not consistent, that's where people get like you have to really start writing, like weird if statements around like, people leaving comments. I don't know why it does this, but if this condition, then like let's flip these parameters around. Now it does what I want. So instead of people trying to code around your sort of crappy, inconsistent API, you've made it consistent from the start at least, and I think that helps a lot. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about. I just really wanted to demonstrate that while I'm not, people that have worked with me know that I love writing coded tests, but I'm also not the person that's like, oh, TDD everything. I think there's a time and place for it. But for me, this was a cool example of I got to experiment with something, put it together, started, it was, keep saying it was working, but how can I make it better? So as I start to tweak it, that's where I was like, if I put tests in place, I can have working snapshots that feel good and make sure they don't break as I keep evolving it. So that's why I wanted to use